This is Drawya. I'm back on this history topic. I really like this topic. I think this is a very undertaught subject, and I think this is very important for us to connect to our history. So, again, I'm going to talk about this. Why do Black people have European last names? The history of so called American Black people. I'm going to do part one because this is going to be kind of exhaustive, not totally exhaustive, but it's going to be a pretty good in depth about some topics that I talked about in my previous videos. Remember the video I talked about how the hidden history between Jamaica and Scotland. There's going to be very similar points to that, but I want to talk about some of the history that is just not taught in school. And like I said it before, I think it's very important for us to connect to our history because when we understand where we come from, we can understand where we're going, and we can understand our mistakes, and we can understand how to prevent them in the future. So let's go straight into it. So again, American Black people, they come from three origins, and the most popular story or narrative that's taught is that we come from the west coast of Africa, which is true. There are a large portion of us came from west coast of Africa, but also a large portion of us were aboriginal to the Americas or the Caribbean islands. We were called the copper colored natives or copper colored Indians. And then the topic that's not discussed the most is the European immigrants or deportees or refugees that came to the Americas in the 1600s, 1700s during the race wars and also the religious wars, and particularly the British Isles. We're going to talk about that in particular, about our history there. And also talking about going back to West Coast of Africa, many of the people who were uh, subjugated to slavery from the West Coast of Africa were deported there from Spain and Portugal as the Jews that were deported from Spain and Portugal, and they went to St. Thomas. And we're going to talk about that eventually. But on this conversation, we're just going to talk about the European ancestry. All right, so this is an article I found. It's pretty interesting. I'm just going to go through it. So, how blacks have Irish last names continued. So, before I proceed, I want to share with you this great African proverb. Until the story of the hunt is told by the lion, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. After reading people's comments to how blacks have Irish last names, I was compelled to continue this insightful discussion by presenting a story about the Black Celts. I am not talking about the Black Celts depicted in this blog. The Vikings were often referred to as the Dark Invaders or Black Foreigners. The Gaelic word for foreigner is Gaul, and for black or dark, dub. And that word dub, that's where we get the modern word duff from. Right here, see McDuff. This is the etymology of that word is Gaelic for Mac Doob or son of Doob, literally black. So that's what Duff means. It means black. When you get Dublin or Dublin, capital of Ireland, the etymology of that literally means black pool from Irish dub, black plus lin pool, in reference to the dark waters of River Liffey. Now that's something that they may have concocted based off historical narrative. It may not mean actual pool, it may just mean black land or the land where black people are. We have to remember when they make the etymologies of these words, the definitions of today, they have to spin it based off historical narrative, not necessarily a historical fact. But at that time, yeah, dub meant or doob meant black. So when you saw someone with that last name, it was depicting their skin pigmentation. It was almost like a characteristic that we will call someone a dark skin or brown skin. You know. So also the word Douglas also means black. Comes from Gaelic dub galis, the dark water. The name of the place in Lanarkshire has given a name in the top 40 for boys born in the U.S. from 1942 to 1971. Name of the city of that is capital of Isle of Man is the same Celtic compound. And you see right here, Ashanti, her last name is Douglas. She gets that from her father. So it's likely that they may have been descendants from the British Isles. That may be her ancestry. Now, going back to the article, I've traveled to Sweden. All I can say is that the Irish have no resemblance to the Scandinavians. Fact is that the Irish or the Celts are more related to the ancient Phoenicians than the Vikings. We're going to get into that. Quote unquote scientific anthropologists and classic historians have proved that the Celts of history were the non Aryan, round headed, darkish, small stature race of South Germany and Switzerland, and that the Celts, properly so called, are totally lacking in the British Isles. Thus, to speak, as is so commonly done, of Celtic ancestry, the Celtic temperament and the Celtic fire amongst any section of the natives of these islands is, according to anthropologists, merely imagination. Also, in the writings of Tacitus, the Roman historian mentions of the dark complexions of the Silures or the Black Celts and maintains that a black Aboriginal race lived side by side with a white one in the British Isle in pre-Roman times. So you see, they already know based off historical evidence that these people were people of color, or at least the majority of them. Continue on. The term Celt, quote unquote, is entirely unknown as the designation of any race or racial element of the language in the British Isles until arbitrarily introduced there a few generations ago. Nor does the name even exist in the so called Celtic languages, the Gaelic, Welsh, and Irish. It is, on the contrary, the classic Greek and Latin title of totally different race of a totally different physical type from the British Isles, and that the word was only produced there by unscientific phlogistic and ethnologists some decades ago. That was from the author L.A. Waddell from his book Phoenician Origin of Britons, Scots, and Anglo Saxons, page 127. On this book, you can find more information about this theory. And that's not just a theory, this is actually the research that they discovered, but they've hidden it because they don't want so-called black people to know that they come from Europe, because that causes a whole change of the whole historical narrative. That will change really the whole face of how things happen. You're like, well, hold on, I came from Europe. I didn't come from Africa. Like, what does that mean? That would change the way people see themselves. That would change the way you see history. That would change the way how you see yourself. And it's a very cons- um, it's a very really conspiracy to make all so-called black people of the Americas believe that they all came from the west coast of Africa. That is very um, planned to make everyone think that, because when you do that, you come to the conclusion that, well, my history starts with slavery, so I have nothing really to look forward to, except that, if I'm better than a slave, at least I'm better than that. So you're always going to be looking for a sense of equality because you're programmed with this inferiority concept complex. But if you understand that you came from much more places of slavery, then you have a sense of more value, because history is very controlling. History controls your thoughts. If you have a negative output of where you came from, it's very difficult to shine the light or see the light into how you can become a better person. That's just in your child. Same way in your childhood, if you had a negative childhood environment or a negative upbringing, it's hard for you to see yourself achieving good things in life. Same thing with the history. If you see yourself as low, or a low level history or low level ancestry, you don't really see yourself in a sense of honor. It's hard to present yourself with royalty if you don't think you ever achieve that. Everything else is going to be kind of fabricated in regards to your identity. So it's important to kind of contort and distort your identity so you don't ever see yourself of value. You see how this is all kind of contrived. All right, so we're going to continue going on, and we're going to break down some of the words that they used in this article. This is the last part. Also, England was settled by the Phoenicians, who sailed to England for trade. The Phoenicians invaded England in 1103 BC, and when they arrived, they found England to be inhabited by the Picts. According to the ancient history, the Picts originally came from Scythia, Scandinavia, settled first in Orkney, and then migrated south. The claim is further supported by archaeologist and professor at Aberdeen University by Dr. Gordon Noble, who states all evidence points to the Picts being indigenous to northern Scotland. They began to coalesce during the late Roman period and formed some of the most powerful kingdoms in northern Britain in the early medieval period. They lived in a tightly knit communities and built their homes out of wood. Although their skill in stone carving is evident from the many engraved standing stones still extant throughout Scotland and housed in museums. These carved stone slabs are the only record the Picts left of their history. The rest of their story is told by later Roman, Scottish, and English writers. All right, so let's go into the definition of some of these words. First, let's go with Celts. So remember, these are like Latin words. So this Celt, the C is pronounced with a hard K. So like how we think about the Boston Celtics is really pronounced Celtic. So also Celt, 1600 circa, from Latin Celta, singular of Celte. The Greeks Ketoi, Herodotus word for the Gauls, who were called Galatia, Galatae, used by the Romans of continental Gauls, but apparently not of the British Celtic tribes. So this word Celt was what the Romans called these people. They didn't call themselves that. Same way today, how we're being called black. That's a term that was given to us. That's not a term that we called ourselves, and that's psychological programming. Okay, so that's something that they call. But as we see that this was a word that was describing these Gauls or these Gaulish tribes. They were called Celts. So let's go into the Gaul word or Gael, 1810 from Scottish Gaelic Gadheel, member of the Gaelic race, which is Irish, Scottish, Manx, corresponding to Old Irish Goidel. Compare Latin Gallus under Gallic. Also see Galatians, the native name in both Ireland and Scotland. Owing to the influence of Scottish writers, Gael was used in English at first exclusively of Highland Scots. I made a video about how so-called black people came with Scottish last names. I think I need to revisit that too. But a lot of them, people who have Scottish last names like Jackson, McGriffin, Griffin, um, Perry, Dixon, those are all Scottish last names. And a lot of Scotland was predominantly so-called black until they were deported from Scotland during a period called the Highland Clearances, and that was actually uh, a result of what in history they call the Jacobite Rebellion, and that was they wanted to clear out these people who supported the previous kingdom before it was changed into another king after the I think the child or the grandchild of King James who made who or authorized the Bible, the King James 1611 Bible. His grandson became a Catholic, and they didn't want that, so they have a civil war, and basically they had a war. It's called the Jacobite rebellions, and as a result of the rebellions, they had these Highland clearances where they basically deported all these Highland Scots from that area, and they moved a lot of different places from the Caribbean to Australia and a lot of places in America. So that was part of their history. That's part of our history. We're going to talk about that eventually. I got to make a video about that. All right, Gallic. So all goes back to Gauls. Let me skip this one a little bit. Let's go to Scot. So Old English Scot, Scotus plural, inhabitants of Ireland, Irishmen from late Latin Scoti, circa 400, a name of uncertain origin. They said it's uncertain. We're going to try to see if maybe we can find the origin. Perhaps from Celtic, but answering to no known tribal name. Irish Scots appear to be a Latin borrowing. The name following the Irish tribe which invaded Scotland 6th century CE. After the Romans withdrew from Britain and after the time of Alfred the Great of Old English were described only the Irish who had settled in the northwest of Britain. Alfred the Great was in the Middle Ages, and I believe he was able to unify a lot of the tribes in the British Isles. But we're going to talk about this word Scot because they said it's from an unknown origin. And remember, this is from Latin. So Latin gets a lot from the Greek, from what we know as modern day English, English that comes from kind of the Germanic languages, which comes from Latin, which comes from Greek. So if we can find a Greek word which is close to Scot, we might be able to find the origin where we get this name from, thus getting the definition. So in the Bible, there's this verse in Luke chapter 11, verse 36, where Christ says, "If thy whole body therefore be full of light, having no part dark, the whole shall be full of light, as when the bright shining as a candle does give light." Oh, I'm sorry. Verse 35, "Take heed therefore that the light which is in thee be not darkness." This word right here, darkness. Let's read this. Dark. Oh, the dark. Yeah, dark. This word dark is scotaneous, or scotinos. So it means full of darkness. Now this has a root word. Let's read that. It comes from scatos. Scatos. It literally means darkness, of night darkness, darkness, darkening eyesight or blindness, but metaphorically of ignorance respecting divine things, human duties, and the company of ungodliness and morality, together with their consequent misery in hell, person whom darkness become visible and hold hands, and also shadiness, obscurity. So darkness. So this is what scatos means. So based off just some thoughts, and I remember I got this from Chronicles of Judah. Shout out to him. This is possibly the root of that word Scot. It comes from the Greek scatos, which would correlate with the Latin. It's just a speculation, and a lot of these, historians, they speculate all the time. So I don't think it's nothing to, nothing wrong to speculate ourselves in order to figure out why we have this term even made here. But that would make sense because we understand that these people in Scotland and the Gaelic regions were so-called people of color. So it would make sense. And then how many people you know with the last name Scott? You see, like Byron Scott, the former basketball player, Bart Scott, the former football player. A lot of so-called black people have that last name Scott. So that would make sense that it would mean someone of color, So I'm just trying to paint that picture that, when we think about Europe, we think about Scotland and Scottish people. We think about Irish people. We think about someone who looks like they're Caucasian, but a lot of our history has been um, forsaken and being mistaught. But those Aboriginal people were so-called people of color, so that's something to definitely consider. So again, we're going back to Gael. This word, uh, member of the Gaelic race, Irish Scottish Manx, and like I said, it goes back to where it says used in English as first exclusively to the Highland Scots. So these people in Highland Scotland, they were so-called people of color, dark people, and also Galatians. When we read about this word Galatians, the biblical epistle in the New Testament, from Galatia, a name of ancient inland region of Asia Minor, from Greek Galatia, based on Gaul, in reference to the Gaulish people who conquered the region and settled there in third century BCE. In Latin, Gallic Graeci, hence Middle English Gallic Crex, the Galatians. So the Galatians were a collection of the Gaulish people. So when we read about the Middle Ages of the Gaul or the Gaelic tribes or the Gaulish tribes who were fighting against the Romans, these were uh, a collection of the Galatians were a part of those group of people. And we understand the Galatians have their connections to Israel because they're the scattering of Israel being unified based off the new covenant by the sacrifice of Christ. So Paul was preaching the gospel, um, at least in part of his missionary trips to these people, Galatians. And we know that they're Gauls, and we understand they have their origins from ancient Israel. So we understand that these people were also people of color as well. So very interesting. Very interesting stuff, right? I know I talked about this before with that last name Gaul, because there are some people, even in the Caribbean, Jamaica, with that last name Gaul. All right, Gaul, Gail. All right, we'll talk about that. We're gonna talk about some other stuff too. So this is Acts chapter 2, verse 5, and I just want to read this to talk about the dispersion of Israel. And there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men out of every nation under heaven. And When this was noised abroad, the multitude came together and were confounded, because that every man heard them speak in his own language. This is the time of Pentecost, quote unquote Pentecost, when the 12 apostles or 12 disciples, they were speaking in different languages. They were speaking in tongues. They were speaking in foreign languages that they never learned before. And the Jews who were scattered throughout these nations, they were confounded. They were surprised that they were able to speak in languages that uh, they're native to, or that they spoke in their homelands. And this is what, a lot of people, they get kind of confused when it says when the all nations are going to be saved in Christ. It's not necessarily talking about every nation per se. It's talking about the elect in those nations. In the same way, it's like if you go somewhere to like how in the scriptures it was like from Parthia, from India, from Ethiopia, from Europe, from Turkey, things like that, Libya. They were all from different parts of the world, but they all had a common ancestry. They all were under that um, uh, election, that grace from the Most High, because they all had their ancestry back to ancient Israel. And, ancient Israel scattered to the four corners. So the people that the Most High is bringing back are going to come back under that nation again. They're going to be scattered because they were scattered, but they're going to come back from their nations, wherever they are, whether in Asia, North America, South America, the Europe, Australia, wherever they are, they're going to come back, because that's how big the dispersion is. All right. Now, talking about Celt Iberia, I want to talk about this because it's also, we know about Celt. That means the Gaulish people. They weren't just in Northern Europe, they were also in Southern Europe. This is Celt Iberia. One thing about Iberian Peninsula, think about the point between Spain and North Africa. So this is the Iberian Peninsula, is Spain, or modern day Spain and Portugal, but in the time they called it Iberia. So one thing about Iberia or Spain, it has this river here called Ebro, the Ebro River. Now let's look up the definition or etymology of the word Hebrew. This is where it comes from. The Hebrew, late Old English from Old French, Hebrew, from Latin, Hebraeus, from Greek, Hebreos, from Aramaic, Semitic, Ebre, corresponding to Hebrew, Ibri, an Israelite, traditionally from the ancestral name Eber, or probably literally one from the other side, perhaps in reference to the river Euphrates, perhaps simply signifying immigrant from Eber region on the other or opposite side. And that's what it means physically. You really cross the other side, but spiritually, when you're a Hebrew, you cross from the other side of the world. You leave the world and you come to life. The same way when the Most High he chose Abraham, he crossed over and from paganism to a real culture, which is the scriptures. The Most High taught him how to live a spiritual life. So the same way when we come into the knowledge, we come into Christ, we cross over. So we live that Hebraic lifestyle. But going into this word Hebrew, this is a word that's actually common. It's a name that's common in the Caribbean and in Latin America. So you have different people with that last name, Hebrew, or they spell with an A, but it's the same word. It's the Hebrew. So you never know. These people may be descendant from these Celts. These Celts who also, some of them were Sephardic Jews who were deported over there. When they read about history in 1492, with the Jews being deported from Spain and Portugal, you just hear about them getting deported back to the Middle East or back to Europe. But they were also deported to the Caribbean. They were deported to South America, Central America. And that's why it's like this brother right here, this soccer player, Anderson Louis de Abreu, he has that last name, so he is possibly a descendant of these people. See, and that's why I say a lot of our people don't know this, and that's why it's like we just think that we inherit these names through slavery. That's not necessarily the case. All right. Now, there's another book. This is the book that quoted in that article we read, The Phoenician Origins of Britons, Scots, Anglo-Saxons Discovered by Phoenician and Sumerian Inscriptions in Britain by Pre-Roman Briton Coins, 1924, by L. Austin Waddell. And now we understand Phoenicians, that's really when they say that they talk about Canaanites, because that's the same thing. In conventional history, they call them Phoenician. In the Bible, they call them Canaanites. Same way conventional history calls Mesopotamia, but in the Bible, they say Babylonia. So the same thing. It's just they just use different words. All right. This is also a book. They talk about this when Scotland was Jewish. DNA evidence, archaeology, and analysis of migration and public family records show 12th century Semitic roots. And they said 12th century, I believe they're meaning AD, but actually it goes back to even the BC period. So, like I said before, prior to the Highland clearances, the majority of Scotland were so called black people, and they were a mixture of Israelites and Phoenicians. After they intermixed, especially under Solomon, uh, and Hiram the First of Hiram the First. If you read that in, I believe, First Kings or um, First Chronicles, I know First Kings for sure, but he was the king that helped build the temple, and he was a Canaanite or Phoenician, and in the Canaanite religion, Canaanite culture, they worship Baal. So a lot of mixture happened when Solomon he started to he had an alliance with Hiram and the Canaanites, but there was a lot of mixture with the people, and they started to embrace the Canaanite culture. And even in today, you have brothers and sisters in the Caribbean who celebrate Juve, and you see a lot of cats they out there. They wear the helmets because Juve is a celebration of the horn god, which the Canaanites worship as Baal or Molech, and that's the same holiday that the Canaanites worship. They called it a different name, but it's the same spiritual origin. So that's why I say a lot of stuff that we do in this world, they have spiritual underpinnings, and we don't necessarily understand that. So, but we have to be aware of what we participate in because we may be participating in some spiritual origins that we just don't know. All right, but we will be held responsible for our ignorance.